When I was making the video for Heart of Darkness, I was reading about a bunch of stories in the Congo in the 1880s. Since, that was the setting that the book took place in, and it used the tragedies of the time as a backdrop. Well, there was one story that kept coming up in research. One story that was so prevalent in the late 1800s that many believe Conrad used it as inspiration for the antagonist of the novel, Mr. Kurtz. The setting for this real and terrible story is the failed Emin Pasha relief expedition. An expedition that went so wrong it was the last sanctioned private expedition into Africa ever. At least, by European nations. And we're going to talk about that some, but what I want to focus on today is a bizarre controversy that came out of this expedition. And that's a question that's believed by many, but debated by some. Did the grandson of the founder of Jameson Irish whiskey pay to have a young girl cannibalized in the Congo? Now, I believe the answer to that question is yes. Probably. We'll talk about it. So hello everybody and welcome to a very dark and bizarre historical controversy. A controversy more commonly known as the Jameson affair. Now, first things first, what we're going to be talking about today is pretty gruesome. And I'm going to be reading some firsthand accounts of the time, which are pretty nasty. So viewer discretion advised. Totally understand if you don't want to hear about this. Also, a couple of housekeeping notes. The redacted collection is available till I think January 11th. So get in on the hat, jacket, notebook, and t-shirt while you can. And if you decide to support, thank you. It means a lot. Also, as I announced at the end of the Heart of Darkness video, Apocalypse Now will be posted to this channel. Yes, if you didn't watch the last video, I'm talking about the Francis Ford Coppola movie will be uploaded here. If you need context, again, see the end of the last video. I'll make a community post or a tweet when we have the exact time for the watch party. I figured it'd be better to do it after the holidays. But even if you can't make the exact show time, it'll stay up on the channel for the foreseeable future. So hopefully you all enjoy that, and thank you for the excitement you've expressed after I announced that. I'm pretty excited about it too. So with that out of the way, if you're excited or terrified to hear about today's story, then stick around after the ad as we talk about the Jameson Cannibal affair. And something else that's disturbing is someone stealing your information while you're browsing the internet. And I'm sure to a lot of us, internet safety seems so complicated we don't know where to start. But thankfully today's sponsor, ExpressVPN, has you covered. ExpressVPN is a VPN, or a virtual private network. It masks your IP address whenever you're browsing the internet, meaning companies or people who are up to no good can't get your personal information. On top of that, it encrypts and routes your internet usage through secure servers. Typically, if you're on public Wi-Fi or a private network like one at work, everyone on that network can see what you're doing. But ExpressVPN lets you browse the internet securely and privately. On top of that, some websites are straight up different if you're in one part of the world compared to another. Websites like Netflix and Amazon have entirely different catalogs based on your region. Well, with ExpressVPN, all you have to do is switch your server to another country and boom, you have access to a whole new world on the internet. The thing I personally like about ExpressVPN is it's tailored to everything I do. If you use the desktop version, it does everything I need on the desktop. If I download the app, it does everything I need on my phone. In the last ARG video, I was trying to find a book that's only available in Japan. I couldn't find it on American Amazon, but when I switched my server to Japan, there it is. And ExpressVPN now has tiered pricing, so you can pay for as much as you want. The basic plan that still gives you 10 devices to connect is only $3.49 per month, or 12 cents a day. Internet safety is one of those things a lot of people don't think about until it's too late. So don't take that chance and find out how you can get up to 4 extra months of ExpressVPN by scanning the QR code on screen or clicking the link in the description below or going to expressvpn.com/Wendigoon. That is right, by using my link, you can get up to 4 extra months when you sign up now. Again, that's scan the QR code or click the link in the description at expressvpn.com/Wendigoon to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all for watching the ad. Thank you to ExpressVPN for sponsoring the video. Their link will be in the description. We are back to the episode. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So to make this story make sense, let's talk about what was happening in Africa at this time. In the late 1800s, a lot of European nations were trying to grab up as much territory in Africa as possible. The land was full of natural resources, and Europeans were using it to cultivate everything from rubber to elephant ivory. To many, this was seen as a humanitarian effort. The Europeans were bravely going to a less advanced region and teaching them things like technology, communication, and transportation, when in reality, the only Asian they really got was exploitation. Several European nations warred against various tribes across Africa, commissioning other tribes to go to war with them. Loopholes and rules around prisoners and punishment allowed for legal slavery. And between disease, famine, and constant skirmishes, people died on either side a lot. However, in the midst of things being pretty bad for most places in Africa, things were really bad in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's because in 1885, the King of Belgium, Leopold II, didn't make the Congo an extension of Belgium as other nations did with their territories. Instead, he bought and personally owned the entire region, calling it the Congo Free State, meaning all of the rules of ethics and trade that other nations had to be clever to avoid, or at least not talk about, didn't matter if the entire country is your own private territory. And again, this was all done under the guise of ethics and helping the local people out, but you can imagine how that went. Well, something that was common around this time was privatized expeditions. Say a country didn't want to send a military force into the jungle to just chart maps or look at local wildlife. Instead, private explorers would raise money and then host their own expeditions. These would be sanctioned by governments because they're often using government land or government equipment, but the routes and objectives were figured out by private explorers. And in the 1800s, these explorers were the European equivalents of rock stars. They were going to new worlds. They were putting new names on maps. Many would come back telling stories of waterfalls, mountain ranges, and animals that other people could hardly imagine. And one of the most famous of these explorers was Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley hosted several expeditions down the Nile River and through the Congo. He's most famously remembered for his hunt for the missing missionary, Dr. Livingstone. However, it would be the expedition that we're talking about today that would seem to be the most troubling of his career. An expedition that he was initially praised for, but then blamed for bringing to light the dark travesties that happened in Africa. So what was the reason for the Amin Pasha Relief Expedition? Well, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, countries having land in Africa. See, in the early 1880s, Egypt had control of a region known as Equatoria, a region that is the southernmost part of what is today South Sudan. Equatoria was an Egyptian territory, but the governor of Equatoria was a man named Amin Pasha. He was the designated leader set to rule over the land on behalf of Egypt, and that was going well for him until 1885. See, in the Sudan region, there was a man named Muhammad Ahmad. Ahmad was an Islamic religious leader who was tired of the Egyptian rule in Sudan, so he led a revolt to kick the Egyptians out. And the revolt went surprisingly well with the capture of Khartoum in 1885. This siege effectively cut off Equatoria's communication and supply line with the rest of Egypt, meaning that effectively Pasha, as well as all of his men, are now trapped there. And considering Ahmad's followers, or Mahdists as they were called, were willing to have a war to kick the Egyptians out, they're probably not going to let this guy live in peace. So in Europe, there began to be an international concern over what will happen to Pasha. Egypt didn't have interest in staging a full-scale war or the capability to do so all the way down to the bottom of Sudan, and other nations wanted to keep their militaries out of it as well. So a few explorers in Europe began to think, what if there was a private expedition to get Pasha out? And Henry Stanley, being one of the most famous and acclaimed explorers at the time, was picked to be the man to lead the expedition. Again, this was a private expedition, but it had the blessing of several European nations. This became especially pressing in February of 1886, when Egypt said that they had intentions to just forget about Equatoria, including, all their stuff and people that are still there. So through the years, Stanley began putting together his team. A team made up of former soldiers, expeditionists, naturalists, and the best minds that he could find. The expedition consisted of 5 officers who hired guides, guards, and couriers, all in all, which by the time they reached Africa, totaled to about 700 men. Before they left London, Stanley gave a speech. In it, he said their purpose is not to destroy or fight with the natives of the land, but to save a man who needs their help. Keep that motive in mind for later. Amongst the people picked for the expedition was a naturalist named James Jameson. James Jameson was the grandson of John Jameson, the founder of Jameson Irish Whiskey, a brand that is today the best-selling Irish whiskey in the world. So James himself came from a lot of money, but his interests didn't lie in the family business. Instead, he was interested in nature. By this time, Jameson had done several expeditions across the world, from the Rocky Mountains of the United States to Africa on multiple occasions. He was the first to identify several bird species in Africa, and birds like the Jameson's firefinch and the Jameson's antpecker are named after him. All that to say, despite his pampered upbringing, he was qualified for the job. Just ignore the title of the video and pretend like you don't know where this is going. Now, an important thing to point out about this expedition is it was not an entirely righteous rescue mission. There were financial motivations behind this, and that was clear from the get-go. At the time of the expedition, Stanley was under the personal hire of Leopold II. So to make this trip make everyone happy, rather than doing the thing when looking at a map would make the most sense and approaching South Sudan from the east, they instead were to take the Congo River through the Congo Free State, which Leopold II owned, so that they could move goods and do business and trade while also trying to save the governor. And also, Leopold II was real big on buying up personal territory. So if Egypt doesn't want Equatoria, well, I guess I know someone who will very righteously of their own accord go save the governor and also maybe perhaps keep the land when we're done. Maybe, just throwing that out there. They were also to transport about 75 tons of ivory on this voyage, but really the governor is who we're here for. The expedition itself was incredibly well funded. In addition to the money they raised, they also had new equipment like the Maxim machine gun. The Maxim they took was actually the first Maxim to ever make it to Africa. They also had a 28-foot steel boat called the Advance that could be broken up into 12 sections and carried over land to reassemble and continue on later. Everything was going great until they got there. On March 18th, they made it to the Congo, and as soon as they got there, no one knew they were supposed to be there. Communication lines had been down, and nothing was prepared for their arrival. So a lot of the expedition's food and supplies had to be bartered for on site, which was also a problem because no one wanted to trade with them. And a big reason for that was someone they brought with them. On the way to the Congo, they went along the east side of Africa first to stop in Zanzibar. There they picked up a man named Tipu Tip. Tip was an incredibly wealthy explorer and trader in Africa. He had supply lines across the continent, and Leopold II was interested in using him to transport goods for this expedition and, maybe potentially future business, I guess, if it comes up. Well, the reason the local Africans didn't want to trade with the expedition was because of Tip. Why, you may ask? Well, because the way Tip made his money was by being one of the most prolific slavers of all time. He is considered the second wealthiest Muslim slave trader in history. The only guy that beat him is Mansa Musa, an emperor. Tipu Tip was such a prolific slaver that he had trading stations set up along the Congo River to move his own slaves. Not a network of selling or trading other people's slaves, just his own. And it was on this very same Congo River where the expedition had now brought him to do business. So yeah, the locals didn't care for that. On top of that, several of the boats they were promised were not ready yet, so they had to commandeer other boats and split up the parties. Stanley broke the group up into two columns, the forward column and the rear column. Expeditions like this take years, so you need a steady supply line to the front to make sure the expedition can keep moving. So the rear column was to maintain supplies and keep a steady flow of them to the front as the front pushes further into Africa. The cannibalism question will arrive out of something that happened in the rear column. So for now, let's talk about what happened to the front column. As soon as they got out on their own, things started to go bad. Members of the front column would periodically die of disease. They would be attacked by various native tribes, a few dying off at a time. And over several months, the forward column ran out of food and were getting more and more desperate. Eventually, Stanley, leading this forward column, made it to Lake Albert, the place where he thought Pasha was supposed to be. Well, he then gets word that Pasha heard they were coming, so he tried to move closer to them and kind of passed each other on the way. Finally, Stanley finds Pasha on April 29th of 1888, over a year since they first started up the Congo. The initial plan was the forward column was going to bring enough food to support Pasha and his men if they had been starving or had their supplies cut off. But by the time they got there, they were the ones starving and Pasha had to feed them. Also, just a weird side note, they had brought 3 bottles of champagne to celebrate whenever they finally found him, and they still had the champagne when they got there, meaning in the midst of all the death and the shooting and the trading, Stanley was not going to let those bottles go. So they get to Pasha, and something happens that Stanley could never have accounted for. Pasha doesn't want to leave. Despite the attacks from the Mahdist, who are continuing to take ground, and despite Egypt saying that they're going to let Equatoria go, he wants to stay there. See, he has his own command over armies and people and capital, and he's convinced that if they can get communication lines back up, everything will be fine. And Stanley thinks this is a horrible idea and they should go right now. Now, some will point to that and say perhaps Stanley was just acting on King Leopold's ideas. Like, King Leopold wants the governor to leave so that can become another one of his territories. And while that might be true somewhat, I feel like Stanley also, after having been, sick and hungry and being shot at in the jungle for a year, doesn't want to be there anymore. The forward column initially consisted of 389 men, and by the time they made it to Bashaw, there was only 169 of them left. Either way, it doesn't matter for now because Stanley doesn't have the resources to go back all the way they just came. So he has to spend nearly another year there going to local forts and putting together more soldiers. Now you would think, wouldn't he have more people on the rear column to help with this supply thing? Again, we'll get to what happened to them. But Stanley wouldn't have enough resources to make the trek back until April of 1889. And at that point, Bashaw still didn't want to go. So on April the 5th, the two had a very heated argument where Stanley said he is leaving April 10th with or without Bashaw. So on April 10th, Stanley leaves and Bashaw comes with him. Again, taking nearly a year once more to get back out. Although this time they passed through various other European territories that helped them out on the way. Also, to add to the absurdity of this whole thing, in December of 1889, the group was in a German territory, and apparently the Germans had a big banquet for them while they were there, and during the banquet, Bashaw got so drunk that he fell out of a window and nearly died. Could you imagine? Like they spent 3 years trying to get this guy, and then he died in a German territory in Africa because he fell out a window. Eventually, the forward column meets up with what remained of the rear column, and everyone returned to Europe in 1890. Stanley wrote a book about his experience called In Darkest Africa. The book was a bestseller, the men were acclaimed as heroes, and all was well for a while. See, like I said, a lot of people died on the expedition, and it wasn't just the local workers, some of them were European officers and officials. So, a lot of people had questions as to what happened in Africa. More specifically, what happened to the rear column? See, the rear column was left in the command of someone named Edmund Bartelot. Bartelot was a former British Army officer and was left over the rear column to take care of the supplies. Well, when Stanley got back to Europe, all that he wrote in his book was that Bartelot had been shot, and James Jameson, who was also left in the rear column, had died of illness. As you could imagine, this explanation wasn't good enough for a lot of people. They naturally wanted to know what went so wrong, but anytime he was asked, Stanley seemed hesitant on the matter. A few European survivors of the rear column, men like William Bonney, had told Stanley what they had witnessed, and Stanley, very purposefully, didn't say what he heard in the book. Well, after enough journalists came asking, eventually, in 1890, Stanley broke his silence. The first major statement of his being published in the Times on November 8th of 1890. See, everyone thought perhaps Stanley was hiding some tale of heroism from the two men that would overshadow his own, or perhaps some tale of failure on his part that led to the men's death. But what Stanley was actually doing was trying to preserve their image, one that was inevitably shattered when the truth came out. It seems that, as corroborated by many of the survivors, things went wrong for the rear column almost immediately. The plan was they would stay behind with the supplies, and then Tipu Tip would get a line of couriers, or at least Stanley referred to them as couriers in his book. In reality, they were just slaves. Tip would have slaves create a supply line for them so that they could continue forward. Well, there was a miscommunication regarding what Tip needed. He was going to trade with slave traders he knew in the region to make a supply line to the front. However, these traders were only interested in trading ammunition that Stanley's forward column had taken with them. So with no means of establishing a supply line, Tip just left, meaning the whole rear column was to sit around awaiting further orders. In the first several months, the rear column ran low on food, and as mentioned, several of the locals didn't want to trade with him. So, in desperation, members of the rear column began kidnapping people from local villages and holding them as ransom in order to get food and supplies. As this was happening, they were periodically attacked and disease began to set in. It's not known exactly how many died because several deserted once they realized things were going bad. This in combination with the fact they hadn't heard from Stanley's forward column in some time. For all they knew, those guys were dead too. But what we do know is out of the over 300 who were left in the rear column, only double-digit numbers remained. From the account Stanley echoed, Bartelot began to lose it. According to Stanley, it sounds that Bartelot began to sow discourse among the men, saying things like, "Why do you think Stanley always returns from Africa alone?" implying that their leader had brought them out there to kill them. According to Stanley's November 8th statement, quote, "I was told that Major Bartelot's life was saved twice by Mr. Bonney. Once when Major Bartelot had suddenly seized a woman and fastened his teeth in her shoulder. I was told that frequently Major Bartelot would cause his black followers to shrink before him by standing in their path in front of the advancing natives and grinning like a fiend. That is the expression that was used. I was told that with a steel-pointed cypress staff, he had run about the camp prodding his people with it, and then flourishing the stick and hitting about him indiscriminately." He goes on to describe one instance in which a 10-year-old boy, who before Bartelot seemed to take a liking to, was kicked so hard by Bartelot that he died. He became militaristic, punishing people under his command for the slightest infraction, having public canings and whippings amongst the men. As you could imagine, this made the numbers decrease further as more people began to desert. According to Stanley, at one point, deserters from the front column made their way back to the rear column, and someone told Bartelot that Stanley had been killed, to which Bartelot replied, "Thank God, I shall be made a colonel now." Bartelot began to write in his journal about how the other men were plotting against him, how they were doing things wrong. Another quote from Stanley, "At one time, Major Bartelot got into such a crazed condition of mind that he asked to retire from the expedition, and he asked Mr. Bonney for a medical certificate, saying as he did so, 'Don't you think I'm sick enough to go home?'" Until finally, Stanley describes how Bartelot died. After keeping the camp in a state of disarray for days on end, Stanley says, "At dawn, Major Bartelot heard some drumming and singing outside his cabin. He sent some Sudani soldiers to try and stop the noise, and afterwards he sent a little boy to them. Their threatening messages produced no effect, however, and finally, Major Bartelot went himself, taking in his hand a loaded revolver and the steel-pointed cypress staff, with which he had already done such mischief. With these weapons in his hands, he walked to the scene of the singing and the drumming, and there he saw a woman beating a drum, accompanying the music with her voice in the usual habit of the Manyuma, who thus start the day at dawn with wild music. Major Bartelot, seeing the woman, ordered her to desist 2 or 3 times, accompanying each order with a prod with his steel-pointed staff or a blow with it. He then began to kick her, upon which her husband, Songa, hearing the screams and seeing Bartelot armed with a revolver, thrust his gun through a loophole in a hut opposite the officer and shot him dead. Bartelot was shot by the husband of the woman he was beating. And tragically, the husband, according to Stanley, was executed just a couple days later. After saying this and then discussing why he kept it out of the original book, Stanley raises this point. "I have censored the whole of the rear guard, and if a sufficient explanation is not found in the foregoing of why I censored them, it is necessary to understand that any of these officers could, with a little firmness, have arrested Major Bartelot's proceedings without violence. A mere letter from any one of them protesting against such acts as I have described and threatening to report them to the Amin Pasha Relief Committee at home would have stopped those acts. This must be clear from the many accounts given, and even from Lieutenant Traup's own narrative, that they disagreed with many things Major Bartelot did." So Bartelot was a man who was given power and abused it thoroughly, ultimately being killed by the very people he abused. So if that guy was in charge of the rear column, you can see why things fell apart. But that's not the story that everyone remembers from the rear column. That's not the story everyone remembers from this expedition. It's the one this video is titled after, the Jameson Cannibal Affair. Keep in mind, James Jameson was a beloved person back home. He came from a wealthy family, went out and charted the world. So when the Times journalist who was interviewing Stanley on the November 8th edition said this, it was a shock to many. Mr. Jameson is accused specifically of standing by while a young girl whom he had purchased for the purpose was deliberately murdered in order that he might be an eyewitness of an act of cannibalism and record the ghastly scene in his sketchbook. Both these men are dead and can no longer answer for themselves. No one would willingly believe statements which, if true, would cover their memory with infamy. It becomes necessary, therefore, to scrutinize very closely the evidence on which such statements rest. Mr. Stanley, of course, believes them or he would not repeat them, and it must be acknowledged that he has only very reluctantly broken silence on the subject. But when the evidence he advances is examined, it amounts in the majority of cases to little more than a repetition of the words, "I was told." This, of course, is sound prima facie evidence, but it is not necessarily conclusive. Much of the following information, says Mr. Stanley, I obtained from Mr. Bonney, the Zanzibaris, the Arabs, and the Manyuma. So Stanley says that James Jameson, the beloved heir to Jameson Irish whiskey, bought a slave in order to watch her be cannibalized. You can hear in the following words how the writer for this article is almost aghast at what he's hearing. Not necessarily calling Stanley a liar, but implying this can't be true. So where does this report come in the first place? Well, there were a few people who bore witness to this cannibalistic act. But the most whole account, and the first one we get in detail, is that of Jameson's interpreter. Asad Farhan followed Jameson around and again acted as his interpreter to the locals. Farhan was the one who began talking about this story after it first happened and reported it to the rest of the rear column that eventually made its way up to some of the front column. These were the reports that Stanley had heard about while in Africa and decided to omit from his book. Well, after Stanley came out with his report on November 8th in the Times, Farhan would come out with his own statement only 6 days later in the New York Times. Or at least the New York Times would publish his affidavit. So we need some background as to when this exact moment took place. According to the story, at several points, Jameson tried to regain contact with Tipu Tip. Jameson would go to him and try to get more couriers so that they can get the supply lines going. Every time Tipu would ask for exorbitant amounts of money that Jameson didn't have. Because keep in mind, Tip left the expedition on their own, but he was still doing business around the area. So if Jameson knew where Tip was, he would try to go find him. Well, it was supposedly while Tip was doing business with the Reba tribe, a group that was around what is now the Lokandu community. While at this tribe, Jameson was with Tipu witnessing a festival. And at this festival, according to Farhan, this happened. Jameson expressed to Tipu's interpreter curiosity to witness cannibalism. Tipu consulted with the chiefs and told Jameson he had better purchase a slave. Jameson asked the price and paid 6 handkerchiefs. A man returned a few minutes afterward with a 10-year-old girl. Tipu and the chiefs ordered the girl to be taken to the native huts. Jameson himself, Salim, Masandi, and Farhani, Jameson's servant, presented to him by Tipu, and many others followed. The man who had brought the girl said to the cannibals, "This is a present from a white man who desires to see her eaten." The girl was tied to a tree, says Farhan. The natives sharpening their knives the while, one of them then stabbed her twice in the belly. She did not scream, but knew what would happen, looking to the right and left for help. When stabbed, she fell dead. The natives cut pieces from her body. Jameson, in the meantime, made rough sketches of the horrible scenes. Then we all returned to the chief's house. Jameson afterward went to his tent, where he finished his sketches in watercolors. There were 6 of them, all neatly done. The first sketch was of the girl as she was led to the tree. The second showed her stabbed, with the blood gushing from the wounds. The third showed her dissected. The 4th, 5th, and 6th showed men carrying off the various parts of the body. Jameson showed these and many other sketches to all the chiefs. This, of course, is a level of evil and depravity that's hard to comprehend. I mean, we hear about things like serial killers or family murderers. But even with monsters like that, there's something comforting in the idea they have to hide it. Even if they don't feel guilt or that they've done wrong, they know they can't let others know that they do wrong. But something this wicked, that it's out in the open and you not only witness it and cause it, but you draw pictures of it, you document it. It's a depravity that's hard to put into words. And this seems to be the story that Stanley heard of and omitted from his original book, but now has gone public with. So what is this then? Just 2 men from an expedition who went mad and acted on their worst impulses, doing the very worst they could with their time before their time was up? Most likely, yes. But when it comes to Jameson's account, there's some speculation. See, this was published November 14th. In the midst of all this coming out about Jameson, Jameson's widowed wife was doing everything she could to save his reputation. She publicly criticized Stanley's account, and as soon as this went up in the New York Times, the next day, her own statement went up. As mentioned, Jameson became ill and died in the Congo. Well, according to her, 2 nights before he died, he sent this telegram. See, the world at large didn't know about this cannibal story yet, but within the expedition, people were talking about it. So according to her, this was sent to Sir William McKinnon, one of the men within the expedition. And amongst the expedition, to clear his name, according to his wife, Jameson said this: "Upon arrival at Ribaruba, the chief invited me to his residence, where I witnessed a curious native dance following other ceremonies, which Tipu said was usually followed by a cannibal feast. I laughed skeptically, whereupon another Arab described a horrible story. I flatly declared that it was impossible that this could happen. The Arab reported, 'Give me a bit of cloth and see.' I thought this a mere ruse to obtain a gift, but the Arab had formerly been kind, so I gave him a piece of 6 handkerchiefs. Then followed the most horrible scene I ever witnessed in my life. The whole thing happened so quickly that it was impossible to make sketches had I wished to do so. Further, I had nothing to sketch with. The small sketches I made were done in the evening at my own house. The girl never looked for help. She seemed to know it was her fate. She never stirred hand, foot, or head. How the girl was obtained I don't yet know, but will send you all the particulars, signed by witnesses as promised.'" Which, I don't know about that. You're sitting around with a group of people, and you hear someone say that they're cannibals, and you go, "Bet." And they're like, "Okay, pay me." And then you pay them, and you're saying you didn't know that would happen. This, for one, is an outright lie. According to several other people who were on the expedition, previously, Jameson had mentioned an interest in cannibalism, and even in his diary, which I'll get to in a second, he talked about cannibals in the region. So even if you want to take this message that the wife's delivered to the papers at face value, it is completely implausible that he didn't believe they would be cannibals after he'd written so much about it. Also, there was a history of this group before and after practicing in cannibalism. There's one report from Stanley that he witnessed Jameson witness the leftover human remains of a cannibal ritual. So him saying he doesn't believe it could happen doesn't make any sense. Now, Assad's account of events is often scrutinized. That's because a lot of people point out that Assad Farhan is an untrustworthy storyteller. As years later, he would say that he recanted this statement and that he made it up because he was mad that Jameson fired him. As a matter of fact, Jameson's wife in this November 15th paper goes to discredit Assad as well. Because after Jameson's statement, it says, "Then follows the statement that Assad boasted of swindling the British government in the purchase of camels at Sockham, where he also made money by dividing with policemen spoils captured from gamblers among the troops. The statement concludes as follows: This is the low brute whose word the Belgium officers would accept to destroy my character." But here's the thing. Even if that's true and that's signed by people that Assad had stolen camels or whatever, his story can't be entirely made up because it corroborates too closely with what his wife's letter said, or his letter that his wife brought to the paper. Because later Assad would say, "Oh, I made the whole thing up." But we know he didn't because both of them mention a purchase of cloth and the act of cannibalism happening. I think what most likely happened is, sure, Farhan may have been mad and he may have wanted to spread this story of what he saw Jameson do. But years later, when this was controversial and everyone was mad that Jameson's reputation was being ruined, Farhan was bullied into recanting his statement. We know he didn't make everything up. It's too close to Jameson's account, so maybe someone coerced him into saying he did. However, there are some other people who bared witness to things relating to this cannibal act as well. Remember how I said William Bonney was one of the surviving Europeans who reported a lot of this to Stanley? Well, Bonney wasn't there when it took place, but according to him, he did see the sketches that Farhan had mentioned. According to Bonney, quote, "Mr. Jameson showed me the sketches and described the scene in detail. I cannot now describe each of the 6 sketches, but they begin with the picture of the girl being brought down, tied by one hand to the native, who holds in his right hand the fatal knife. He is then represented thrusting the knife into the girl, while the blood is seen spurting out. Then there is the scene of the carving up of the girl limb by limb, and of the native scrambling for the pieces and running away to cook them. The final sketch represents the feast." Now, a lot of people will nitpick the details between Bonney's account and Farhan's account. Like Farhan says the final sketch was the dismemberment, but here Bonney's saying it was the feast. Some pointed that to say perhaps Jameson stuck around for the feast afterwards, but I also think it's possible these are two different people describing 6 pictures they saw once, so maybe there's just some variation there. You'll see these 6 sketches depicted online, but we don't have the original 6 sketches. They're just recreations based on these accounts. Man, I just noticed that sunlight is hitting me in the face. That's intense, whatever. Stanley goes on to say that Bonnie elaborated more to him back in Africa, saying that Jameson went as far as to say he takes pride in being the only European to have witnessed this happen. Which again, see what I said earlier about incomprehensible evil. But as these reports were coming out, a lot of people just didn't believe him. I mean, Stanley had an expedition go horribly wrong. It would be tempting to throw the blame on someone else, so a lot of people thought maybe he's just throwing the blame on 2 people who can't defend themselves. A lot easier to write off that they went mad and became evil than you didn't do your job. And there's a lot of name calling and blaming and he said, she said across this whole thing. Thankfully, we can cut through a lot of the noise and just ask Jameson himself. Not in a letter he might have wrote to someone else he was working with to save face, but what he wrote to himself in his diary. Jameson himself died of fever on August 17th, 1888. He was trying to make it to a contact at a telegram station and did get there, but died the day after. Well, Jameson was a naturalist, and naturally, he documented all of the wildlife and things that he came across on his journey. After he died, this diary was published in 1890, published under the title, The Story of the Rear Column of the Amin Pasha Relief Expedition. And, before any controversy, before he might have been trying to save face, he wrote about that day. And this is what he said. Shortly after witnessing a tribal dance, Jameson says, Tipu Tip, who came in before it was over, told me that they usually kill several people and have a grand feast, for the Wakusa are terrible cannibals. He then told me, amongst other stories, that long ago, when fighting near Malila, they killed a great many of the enemy. The natives who were with him were cannibals, and not a body could be found next morning. He tells me the 2 men will easily eat 1 man in a night. He sent for water in the night to wash his hands and to drink the water there, being in a well. When it was brought, he could not make out why it stuck to his hands and was so oily and bad to drink. Next day, he and several Arabs went up to see what was the matter with the water, and there they saw a most horrible sight. The top of the water was all covered with a thick layer of yellow fat, which was running over the side, and he found out that his natives had taken all the human meat to the well to wash it before eating. At the next place, he camped by a stream and made the natives camp below him. I told him that people at home generally believed that these were only travelers' tales, as they are called in our country, or in other words, lies. He then said something to an Arab called Ali, seated next him, who turned round to me and said, "Give me a bit of cloth and see." I sent my boy for 6 handkerchiefs, thinking it was all a joke, and that they were not in earnest, but presently a man appeared, leading a young girl of about 10 years old by the hand, and I then witnessed the most horribly sickening sight I am ever likely to see in my life. He plunged a knife quickly into her breast, twice, and she fell on her face, turning over on her side. 3 men then ran forward and began to cut up the body of the girl. Finally, her head was cut off, and not a particle remained, each man taking his piece away down to the river to wash it. The most extraordinary thing was that the girl never uttered a sound, nor struggled until she fell. Until the last moment, I could not believe that they were in earnest. I have heard many stories of this kind since I have been in this country, but never could believe them. And I never would have been such a beast as to witness this. But I cannot bring myself to believe that it was anything save a ruse to get money out of me, until the last moment. Again, it's a brutality that's hard to imagine. For all we know, Jameson could have been patting it down here as well. Maybe Bonnie's account is more accurate, that he was elated that he was the only European that got to witness this. Maybe after the excitement was over, he decided it would look bad on paper and changed his tone as he was writing it down. Either way, it seems apparent that he traded the pieces of handkerchief and he got that girl killed. Sure, he doesn't follow exactly what Ferran said. He didn't buy a slave and then pass her off to the cannibals. At least that's not how Jameson perceives it, but Ferran knows that's exactly what he did. I'm sure those 6 pieces of handkerchief was the price it took to buy that girl. So Ali, the man with Tipu, went over, bought a slave on Jameson's behalf, and then gave her to the cannibals. The entire story creates a picture that's hard to quantify. but at the same time is so indicative of what was taking place at this point in history. There were unspeakable things being done in the region, and several of them before the settlers ever got there. Tipu Tip and his men so accustomed to slavery and death that they treat it like a game, in a region where something as egregious as cannibalism is just a thing that happened. But think about the mindset of the Europeans here. Their whole statement, their purpose of doing this was to go into this world and to make it better, to share with them what we know so well, that we can use our technology and our civility as saviors to show our betterment. Only to go there and at the first opportunity, present yourself with the worst. Bartelot was the same way. He had the opportunity to exercise what he wanted, control, power, and might, and he did that until he couldn't anymore. And in the most charitable interpretation of Jameson, he was so obsessed with documenting the world and seeing all the things in it that he forgot it wasn't just pictures he was looking at. When Jameson died at that telegram station, the man that he was there to meet, Herbert Ward, was at his side. And according to Ward, Jameson's final words were this: Ward, they're coming. Listen. Yes, they're coming. Now let's stand together. Perhaps Jameson's family heard this and thought he was thinking of chariots or of some heavenly band come to take him home. Or, if he never found a reckoning in this life, perhaps he found it in the next. It's easy to see why a lot of people think that Bartelot and Jameson inspired Mr. Kurtz from Heart of Darkness. I mean, Joseph Conrad was working on the Congo at the time this story was coming out. He undoubtedly heard about it and then wrote a story with a surprising amount of similarities. And I think the themes I talked about in that story do a better job at encapsulating my feelings with this whole event better than I ever could. Sometimes it is hard to think about the amounts of depravity people will get up to when left to their own devices. The mind of man is capable of anything, after all, and without barriers, it's capable of great evil. But I'm glad that Stanley, despite the shame that this story brought him, came forward with it. If for no other reason, we now have the memory of a little girl in Africa. One who lived a life harder than I could possibly imagine. Who, if nothing else, at least she won't be forgotten. And that's mostly everything you need to know about the Jameson cannibal affair. And I know this is rough and I know these topics are heavy, but that means I especially want to say thank you for watching. I've heard about this story for a long time, but everyone just talks about the discrepancies around the different accounts regarding the cannibalism, not all the crazy other stuff that happened on the expedition. Like, how are you not going to mention that the guy in charge of Jameson was biting people and then got shot for beating a woman? I feel like that relates and sets the scene for why this cannibal thing was such a big deal in the first place. It is a very dark and disturbing corner of history in an area of history where a lot of disturbing and dark things were done. But I don't know, it may just be a morbid fascination, but I also feel it's important to remember our darker chapters. If nothing else, to further elevate the light that comes out of them. So hopefully you found the topic interesting. Sorry for such a bummer. Hope you had a Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year. Thank you all for the support you've shown on the channel in 2025, and I've got a ton of really cool things planned for 2026. Every year, you guys elevate my life to a level I didn't know was possible. You're among my greatest blessings, and I'm thankful every day for the opportunities you allow me. So hopefully you decide to stick around, and thank you all for the support you've shown thus far. Again, merch is available for a limited time at wendigoon.shop. Get in on it while you can. And Apocalypse Now is coming soon. Stay tuned for a community post or a tweet about that. And I believe that should do it for now. But before I go, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye! Also, his whole argument was he didn't realize what they were doing. At what point do you realize that's what they're doing? Like, you just said you don't believe that cannibalism can happen. And then someone's like, want to bet? And then you bet money on it. And then you watch them get the knives and bring her over there. When are you like, oh, maybe it can happen? This guy was lying the whole time. I don't like him at all. I mean, look at him. Look at his stupid haircut. And I hate that mustache. That's so just, can you think about all the germs, like the spit that was around back then? I bet he just had all of that here all the time. I'm mad. Okay, bye.